Hello and welcome to this AMBS webinar on how we teach sustainability topics at AMBS. I'm Ellen Buchan and I'm looking forward to an hour of really interesting insight, and shortly I will hand over to Marie Dutordoir to start the conversation. Before I do, some housekeeping. We want to keep the session to be as interactive as possible, so if you have any questions, just add them to the question box for us to answer live at the end. And if you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in the post-event comms on the AMBS websites within the next week. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Marie.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Alan, for the introduction. So welcome, everyone, to this AMBA webinar, and thanks very much to AMBA for inviting me. So I'm Professor Marie Dutordoir, and I'm a professor of finance. So I teach and I do research on corporate finance at Alliance Manchester Business School. But also since August of this year, I am the director of the Full-time MBA at Alliance Manchester Business School. So what I will do in the next 45 minutes, allowing you about 10-15 minutes for questions if you have any, is this presentation falls into two main parts. So the first part, I will discuss a little bit our philosophy, our approach on teaching sustainability topics, specifically in the MBA, but a bit more generally also in Alliance Manchester Business School. And then I thought maybe the best way to show you how we teach sustainability topics here is to give you a taster lecture. So it is a summary of a lecture that I would normally teach to my MBA students. It's about ESG and corporate finance, and hopefully it gives you a little bit of a grasp of the way I and by extension maybe also my colleagues approach ESG topics in our MBA teaching. So let me start here. So Alliance Manchester Business School, for those of you who don't know us that well, we are a very old business school, founded in 1965. We're triple accredited. And what we are very proud of, obviously, is that we are first in the UK and seventh in the world for ESG, and second in the world for societal impact, according to the FT ranking. So that, of course, made us extremely proud because we have sustainability in our core mission, our core vision as a university. And so our performance in the rankings aligns very well with that mission, with that vision of us. Social responsibility is not something that we've recently jumped on. We're not a school that has very recently jumped on the bandwagon of social responsibility. It is almost literally embedded in the stones of our business school. It has been with us since 1965, because our founding director, Gregor McClelland, really already, he was a pioneer. He placed the value of social responsibility at the heart of our business school. And he strongly emphasized that it's not just about profit making, it's about being ethical and socially responsible. On the long term, that will benefit your business as well. And in addition, he was a pioneer because he emphasized the learning by doing method, which we now call the Manchester method, which basically means that we're not just pontificating about theory to our students. Our lectures always have a practical approach as well. And through practice, our students learn to apply the theory. So we call that the Manchester method. And along with our emphasis on sustainability, I would say those are the two core distinguishing elements of our MBA. So ESG and our MBA. So we have social responsibility as a core strategic goal. So it's not just a very cloudy, faraway mission or vision. We have translated that into 5 very specific strategic priorities, which if any of you is interested, you can find that on our website. So what is nice about these priorities is that they're both outward facing. So some of them talk about how we interact with our local community, for example, in Manchester, but also inward facing. Some of them talk about how we encourage well-being among our staff and our students. Some of them talk about how we encourage diversity in our student population. So one of the things we are quite proud of is that we have almost 50-50 gender split in our MBA students. So that is also sustainability. That is EDI, which links with our profile of diversity and sustainability. What we don't want to do in our MBA is kind of pigeonhole sustainability in separate courses. So our approach is very much that sustainability and ethics should be a part of all of our courses. And we are very successful in that. So all of our core courses have a sustainability ESG element in that. Another element that we really pride ourselves on is that we work closely with community organizations that have a positive impact in our local area. So we are a civic university. We are literally in the city center of Manchester, having the museum, having the all kinds of initiatives on our doorstep, and we work with these organizations, thereby improving the local community. One element in the MBA that perhaps best embodies our focus on sustainability are the not-for-profit projects. So what does that mean? Well, it means that our students are split into teams, and these teams act as consultants. And literally from day one, our MBA students arrive here. They will start working on the not-for-profit project, and this will culminate actually tomorrow into a wonderful celebration where our not-for-profit clients are there. So several organizations from charities, third sector organizations, both local and some are from Wales and further away in the UK. And so the clients, the students, the supervisors will all celebrate together following the final presentations. And our students have spent the past weeks and months working intensely with those charity organizations, working on a very specific question to help them. For example, it could be related to how do we market our charity products, which could be, for example, crafts. Should we rent more space? Should we expand to other areas? So our students work on these very specific questions with these not-for-profit organizations. But the project is just one element. So in addition to that, as I said, we embed sustainability in all of our courses. So this is just a few examples. In a course on leading and management, we explore the transition to a net zero economy. In finance courses, so I'm a finance professor myself, so this is in my comfort zone. We talk about green securities, green bonds, for example. We also talk about what happens if a company gets embroiled in a scandal related to modern slavery, for example. What happens to their stock prices? So I talk with my students, for example, about scandals in the fast fashion industry in England and how that affects stock prices of companies. So I don't see ESG and sustainability as a separate issue that should be taught in a separate course. I think it will become, and it should become, and that's very much the approach we have here, part and parcel of the courses that we teach. And all of our courses are taught by experts in the respective areas who are very much on top of what the ever-evolving research on ESG is telling about their particular topic. And as such, we are ranked best in the UK for embedding ESG content into our core curriculum. And this doesn't happen in a haphazard way. It happens in a very deliberate, careful way. So we add ESG as and where it helps our students to get a more holistic understanding of the topic. So that is the first part of my presentation. I know this is all very much in a nutshell. So if you have any further question, if you are a prospective student or you want to know more about our ESG provision, talk to me, and I have my email address at the end of the presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions on that. But as I said, probably, the Manchester method, learning by doing. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you a taster of how I would teach ESG to my corporate finance students. So in the next, let me check how much more time I have. In the next, let's say half an hour, I will give you a crash course of ESG and corporate finance. And my crash course falls into three main parts. First of all, what are the drivers of a firm's ESG performance? So if you would look at two otherwise identical two companies, and company A and company B, and they have a very different ESG score from each other, what could be a reason for that? Okay, so that's what we will discuss first. We will discuss some determinants that have been shown in the literature to be important in affecting a company's ESG performance. So that's part one. Part two, we will look at, okay, how does my ESG performance affect my company risk, my company shareholder value? So these are both very important metrics, and also my corporate actions. So do companies take different actions with respect to their mergers and acquisitions, financing, and even how much they pay their management, depending on their ESG performance? So does ESG performance have any real effects as well? So that's the second part. And then finally, I will conclude with some trends in ESG research. As I said earlier, ESG research is not like a static thing. It keeps moving, it keeps evolving. Every day, new studies pop up on my Google Scholar alert on ESG. So where is it all heading? So that's where I will conclude. And then finally, the floor is up to you. I'm sure you will have lots of questions. So I will take questions at the end. Before we start, so I know that the literature sometimes uses the term corporate social responsibility rather than ESG. I will use the term ESG throughout this talk, just for consistency. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So basically, what a company does to help society. This taster session is based on a variety of academic and popular press sources. I have provided some references in the slides, but I'm always happy to give you more references in case you are particularly interested in one of the specific topics. I am a corporate finance professor, so I will only touch very superficially on the investor side of it. So in addition to what I'm telling you here, there is a huge literature on socially responsible investing. So let's say if you buy a green bond versus a normal bond, everything else equal, should you make more money on the green bond than on the normal bond? So that's a question I will not discuss here. So we will not take the investor viewpoint here. Again, maybe Amba can invite me another time to discuss that part of the story. Today, we only focus on the corporation side. Obviously, biggest disclaimer of all, this is just a taster session, okay? So it will be very, very high level. It will be very fast. In my actual MBA workshops and lectures, of course, I would spend a lot more time. I could easily spend 3 full days on the next 30 minutes that I'm going to cover here. I would leave ample space for interaction, discussion, questions, case studies, guest speakers. So you're really getting the speedy version of what I would normally do with my MBA students, obviously. So let's start with the first part of the presentation. So first of all, okay, so if you look at two companies, they have different ESG performance. Why is that the case? So in that context, I would like to refer to a very interesting study by Liang and Renneboog, published in 2016, but still relevant today. They studied 23,000 companies, and they looked at their ESG ratings, companies around the world, and they asked a very, very basic question. What drives differences in ESG performance across companies, captured with certain ESG ratings? Now, what they found, and I find this quite surprising, is that the biggest driver is the legal origin of a firm's country of domicile. So a firm based in a civil law country, civil law is like France or many countries in Europe, will on average have a better ESG performance than a firm based in a common law country, like the UK, for example. And this trumps everything else. It trumps things like country characteristics, other than the legal origin, firm characteristics, politics, and all kind of other characteristics. So this legal origin is very, very important as a driver. Now, why is that the case? Well, if you look at civil law, some of you might actually be law experts, I'm not, but if you look at civil law countries, a common feature they have is there's a lower risk that shareholders will sue the company. So companies in those countries feel a little bit more confident to get into ESG activity because they feel less likely that the shareholders will sue them for engaging in this kind of activity. Sometimes shareholders are not happy with ESG activity because they believe it's harmful for profit. So companies feel more relaxed in a way to get into ESG activity. Also, these civil law countries in general have more state involvement and stronger regulations on stakeholder welfare. So, for example, they have stronger unions pushing for employee welfare. And as a result, again, the push from society and company activity on ESG are more aligned than in common law countries. So I find this quite interesting because it shows that a company's ESG performance is not just driven by the company itself, but also by the institutional context in which the company is active. Now, of course, in an MBA lecture, that would be the ideal time to pause, to ask who of you here is a law expert, and to talk in more depth about this interesting crossover between corporate finance and law. But of course, here I don't have time to do that. I just wanted to flag this to you as an interesting fact. Another interesting fact, and this comes from a study by Killen et al. 2021, which is a summary study. So basically what they did is they summarized previous findings on what drives differences in ESG ratings across companies. So they identified a few interesting determinants, leadership characteristics. Not surprisingly, if you have multinational boards, for example, you will typically have better ESG ratings. Why? Because if you have people from different nationalities together, you have more diversity, and that typically means more likelihood to take into account the needs of different stakeholders, so a better CSR performance. However, maybe something a little bit more surprising, if you have a CEO, so company management, who has a daughter, so it doesn't have to be firstborn, any daughter in your alignment of children, you will be more likely to have a better ESG performance. And the reason of that is that, I mean, we all know that we as parents influence children, but apparently also children can influence parents. It has been shown, this is the gender socialization theory, that females have typically a stronger push towards taking care of stakeholders, the environment as a whole, okay? And apparently CEOs with daughters will partially absorb these preferences of their daughters. So they will themselves also become more focused to the environment. That is what studies have shown. So CEOs with daughters have, on average, a company with better ESG performance than CEOs without daughters. The same holds for married CEOs. Apparently, also they absorb the ESG preferences of their spouses. So that's a little bit where the research is heading. So we don't consider management as a black box, but we open this box and we see, okay, what are the personal characteristics of CEOs and how does that affect our ESG performance as a company? So I think that's also a very interesting line of research. So that was the first part of the presentation. So differences in ESG performance across companies can be driven by institutional context and also the characteristics of the companies themselves. Now, let's talk about, I mean, how does it affect you as a company to have a good ESG performance? Well, it can affect you in several different ways. First of all, it can affect your company risk. What has been shown, for example, is that during the pandemic, companies with good ESG performance actually were better able to withstand the crisis in terms of their stock returns. Not all research shows that, but some papers show that. What is the underlying rationale here? Well, ESG performance, similar to, for example, having a strong brand value, acts like a bit of a safety cushion around firms. And it enables the company to be a little bit sheltered against negative cash flow shocks. Also, for example, it makes your customers a little bit less sensitive to the price of your product. So people might want to pay a little bit more, for example, for a pair of jeans that is from a sustainable company than if it's from a brand that is not known as sustainable. For those brands, the consumer may be much more price sensitive, which is, of course, a very important argument in the current cost of living crisis, because it kind of drives how much of the input cost increases a company can transfer to the consumers. If you have good ESG performance, you might be a little bit more sheltered against the effects of that. And then lastly, if you are greener in terms of your production, if you invest in green energy, green plants of production, you might become more efficient and your input costs might decrease, and you might become less sensitive, for example, to oil price shocks, which also decreases your risk. So ESG performance can have a good impact on your risk in the sense of decreasing your risk. Also, interestingly, firms' ESG performance has been shown to negatively affect their legal risk. So if you have a good ESG ratings, typically, if you then get involved in a lawsuit, people have shown that you then get a more lenient settlement on average. So a good ESG performance can have a negative impact on your risk, which is, of course, which could be a desirable outcome for companies, because this in turn could, for example, affect the cost at which they can raise debt financing. So debt providers will typically charge a higher rate if you're very risky. So in that sense, ESG can affect your cost of capital. So that's the effect on risk. It can also affect your shareholder value. So for companies, of course, I mean, I have an entire MBA elective on shareholder value because it's such an important concept. For companies, shareholder value is, of course, very, very important. As a CEO, even your part of your salary might depend on it. So one of the most debated questions is, does ESG performance affect shareholder value, and in what way? And there's still a debate ongoing on that, so I can't give you a black or white answer to that. The answer is, well, it depends. So different studies find different things. So on the one thing, of course, if you are good at ESG, you will typically have a better reputation. So you might get more sales because consumers want to associate themselves with a brand that is sustainable. It could also be easier to attract good employees. If I talk, for example, to our current MBA students here at AMBS, I find that in applying for jobs, they are quite sensitive to the ESG performance of companies. So if you have a good ESG rating, you might be more likely to attract the best of the best MBA students, for example. If you have a bad ESG ratings, it might be more difficult these days. So a better productivity in your company, better performance because you have the best employees. As I said earlier, a lower cost of capital potentially because you're less risky. And also, I mean, don't forget that even if ESG doesn't affect your cash flows directly, some funds these days have to hold a certain percentage of firms with high ESG performance. So just the demand for money by these funds can already boost your stock price. On the other hand, so that's also typically of our Manchester approach, we don't give you a black or white view, we give you the full picture on ESG. So there is another side to this. ESG activities can reduce your shareholder value by creating costs. So it could impose unnecessary costs on the firm, for example, to engage in a lot of philanthropic activities. And sometimes managers engage in this ESG activity just to boost their own reputation at the expense of shareholder value. So they want to feel good about themselves, and they engage in ESG just for the sake of it, without it having a very good impact on their shareholder value. So those are the two opposing views, at least theoretically. What does the actual evidence show us? Well, an analysis of nearly 2,000 studies, so that's the extent of the literature on this already, shows that about 90%, so that's quite a hefty number, find a non-negative, so neutral to positive, impact of ESG on corporate financial performance, so mostly shareholder value or profits. So that's quite a rosy picture, isn't it? So that means that 90% of studies find that actually there's a positive relation between ESG and the financial performance of your company. However, and that's again one of the things we always emphasize to our students, correlation does not mean causality. So it's not because you observe a positive relation between ESG and financial performance that it means that this ESG causes the financial performance. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. It could also be that only companies that have high profits, that have good shareholder value, find that they have the bandwidth and the slack to engage in ESG. So it could actually be the other way around. It could be the financial performance that affects the ESG rather than the other way around. So that is the problem we face in our research. What is driving what? Now, luckily, there are some ways around this. But first, let me discuss the impact of ESG performance on corporate actions, because that's also a very important topic. So first of all, there is a literature on mergers and acquisitions. So acquiring firms with good ESG ratings typically have better stock price reactions to their announcement. So what does that mean? Why is that the case? Well, if I'm an acquirer and I have a good ESG performance, typically the market believes that it will be easier for me to integrate the target into my firm. Why? Well, my ESG performance means that I typically treat my employees well, so they will have a larger loyalty for me, and they will want to go the extra mile to help me integrate the target into my firm. So your ESG performance can actually affect the success of your M&A deal. The same holds for equity offerings. So if I'm a company and I want to go to the market to raise more equity financing, actually, if I have a better ESG rating, I have a more favorable stock price reaction to that. However, it's a bit of a complicated picture here, because those firms with good ESG ratings that raise equity, we actually find that they don't use the proceeds of the offering in a better way. So the market seems a little bit confused by these good ESG ratings of companies. And finally, CEO pay. So do companies with good ESG performance, do they get away with paying their managers less? So would a manager accept a lower salary for enjoying the reputational effect of working in a company with good ESG performance? Here, the literature is not clear. Some studies find an answer of yes to that question, whereas others are inconclusive. So in short, this is a big field still. Each of these three elements I could easily discuss in a full day. But what is next? So where are we heading with the research? I think there are three directions of future research. The first is about ESG legislation. Of course, this is a field in full development, and regulators are catching up with ESG in their, for example, disclosure regulations. So more and more studies examine the shareholder value effects of ESG legislation. One example is my own study, in which I examined the shareholder value effect of the 2015 UK Modern Slavery Act. So some of you will know, some of you will not know. So modern slavery is a horrific crime where basically people are kept in captivity or put in an enormous debt that they then have to pay off by working for companies. So the UK Modern Slavery Act basically forces companies, all qualifying UK companies, to put visibly on their web page a link to a statement in which they outline what they do to address modern slavery in their focal business and their supply chain. So if you click on, for example, if you go to John Lewis or Tesco or any big company you regularly interact with, you go to their webpage, you will, or you should at least see a link to their modern slavery statement. So what we examine in our paper is, how does this affect the stock price of these companies that suddenly have to produce a statement like that? What we find is that actually, for the full sample of UK firms, it doesn't have any effect. But if we zoom in on those companies that have a high risk of having actual slavery in their operations, for example, companies that are very active in high-risk countries, that have a high incidence of child labor, for example, they react more negatively. So basically, what investors become after this new regulation is they become more aware of the risk of slavery for companies. Whereas before this new regulation, they may not have been aware of that. So that's just one example that we have implemented in terms of new regulations on ESG. What is the impact on the shareholder value? I think another direction where the literature is heading is, in the early stages, sorry, we considered ESG as like some kind of block, okay? So you look at ESG performance as a whole. I think now people are looking more and more at, first of all, the social element. So the E and the G have received a lot of attention, the S a little bit less. So people are looking more at that now. But also, people look at how does the E, the S, and the G influence and sometimes counteract each other. One example is, I find in a very recent paper that I'm actually submitting to a journal in the next few days, that following a shock in your emission cost under a cap and trade system, so if your emission cost increases, if you're very polluting, you're more likely then to take on more women in your board as a company. So again, this is this gender socialization theory that if I have more pressure in my E dimension, so I get more environmental pollution cost, I need more women on my board to help me deal with that problem. So we do, for a set of European firms, we do effectively find this to be the case. And also, interestingly, E, S, and G can push you in a different direction. And sometimes by optimizing one element, you can actually harm another element. I had an interesting conversation with a bank, for example, where they argued, yeah, the government is pushing them to impose more environmental friendly requirements. For example, if they give a mortgage, to nudge their consumers, for example, to install solar panels and do all kinds of improvements to improve efficiency of houses environmentally. But of course, this might push up the cost of living, the cost of housing, and thereby harm the chances of certain people to obtain affordable housing. So you actually improve your E, but you harm your S. So how these different elements interact, that is also an element of huge, huge interest. Finally, what the literature is also doing is, we don't take these ESG ratings as gospel anymore. We are more and more critical and more evaluating, like, how do these ratings compare? Why are they so different? So if you look at different ratings, as you see here in the slide, this is not my work, this is work by Burke et al. 2022. If you look at ratings, several ratings for a given firm, you will often see a very big dispersion in the ratings. So why is it the case? Is this a problem? It could not be a problem, it could be a problem, but we're starting to see that problem, okay? So we're starting to see that there is a huge disparity in ESG ratings. So actually, and I would link that in my MBA lectures with an article in The Economist, which quite provocatively suggests that, well, given that all these ESG ratings are so different, shouldn't we just ditch them all and just look at one measure, which is carbon emissions? So we would just look at only carbon emissions, because that's the only really quantifiable metric for ESG performance. Other people are arguing, no, this is not a big deal that we have this big divergence. The market is still growing. The market is still green. Healthy competition is actually good because we're still making up our mind, and different rankings might tell us different things. So if this would be an MBA workshop, I would now pause and ask, what is your view? And I had very interesting discussions on this already in my MBA workshops. For example, where one student was arguing, well, there should be only one provider, a monopolist, and that should be then the rating. But then others were saying, well, no, because then this monopolist would get too much power. So you can get really, really lively, interesting discussions with students. And I think it's also very important for students to realize that a lecture that I give on this today could be very different from one that I give in a year from now, because this is a field in full development. So to conclude, I cite Alex Edmonds, who says ESG is both extremely important and nothing special. So again, this is maybe a little bit provocative. What he means is ESG is, of course, really, really important. All companies should not ignore it. All companies should look at it, but it will become mainstream. It will become normal, an essential mainstream element of our business making. Similar that I remember, like 15 years ago, it was all about intangible assets, R&D, brand value. And now we say, yeah, of course, a company will consist of intangible value as well. We have to also manage intangible assets. So now we say, of course, we have to also take into account ESG. Is nothing exotic. It is a no-brainer, really, that we should take it into account. Despite literally thousands of articles on this topic, there are still many outstanding questions, as you can see. So nothing of this is written in stone. If I give this lecture again in a year or even in 6 months, there will be new evidence. And of course, that makes it a very, very interesting topic. I hope I have shown you with this small taster lecture that it's very, the way I approach this with my MBA students is I want to be critical. So I don't just give them one side of the story. I always give them the full evidence. So not just the positive view on ESG, ESG will improve your shareholder value, but very much also the caveats of no, it doesn't always. And yes, it's not always easy to, for example, disentangle correlation from causality. So I give them the full picture. I think what is also very important, we are working in an academic context here. So our teaching, also for MBA students, is very much research-based. This is not some wisdom that we can get off social media. This is really underpinned by top-notch studies on ESG. And I find that also very, very important, because ultimately we want our students to be able to have very informed discussions, nuanced discussions as well on ESG. So I do think research plays a very important role here. So that is basically the end of my input here. I know some of you are practitioners, and I really hope if you have any insights on this matter, do let me know. Drop me an email if you have questions or comments. And I'm also very happy to take some questions now. So thank you in advance.